in your book differentiate between dragnet surveillance, which I
Hmm.
alluded to earlier, and directed, and how basically, you know, post 9/11, we know because of the Snowden
Yeah.
revelations that
Yeah.
there was a lot of national dragnet surveillance
Yes.
in the United States.
Yes.
You kind of uncover how that's happening with these major police departments at the local
Hmm.
municipal level, but like in a huge city like Los Angeles.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're exactly right. Post 9/11, there was this huge influx in federal funds into increased surveillance. But the people who are really on the ground collecting that data day to day, a lot of it is local law enforcement agencies. And then they send that information up to fusion centers, which are these, typically federally funded multi-agency, multidisciplinary surveillance organizations that aggregate all this information, and then they make that available to the feds, that information available to the feds. So these fusion centers, they were created in the wake of 9/11, largely because the terrorist attacks were viewed as like a case of information sharing failure in the intelligence community. And so they said, okay, look, if we can get all of the information that on the ground local law enforcement is collecting, make it available to the feds, they're sort of on the front lines of the war against domestic terror. And so it began sort of as this like federal counterterror thing, but then there's this concept called function creep, right? The idea that like data originally collected for one purpose can be increasingly used for another. And so then local law enforcement is like, hey, we can start using this data too for our local policing.
Right. And that's kind of how all policing works, right? The reason that police have access to advanced weaponry and you see glorified tanks rolling through people's hometowns is
Yeah, like the
because
pumpkin festival in New Hampshire and
yeah,
all that. Yeah.
it's because a lot of the excess kind of militarized weaponry
Hmm.
then it gets turned on you domestically. Whatever militarism the United States is engaging in abroad, I mean, like frankly, we're seeing this is beyond the scope of your research, but we're seeing this with
Huh.
Israel right now, where
Yeah.
they
Hmm.
are the fascism is coming home, and what they've inflicted on the Palestinians, what we did in the war on terror came into our own police departments, and it accelerated a lot of the abuses that like have become notorious, obviously.
I think the militarization story, I'm trying to shed light on this kind of hidden part of that, which is, like you said, there's been some good coverage of the militarization of police in terms of local police departments getting access to surplus military kit, like the military hardware, right?
Hmm.
But I think that a really important and pretty invisible part of this story is also the creep of military software, right? Like data and surveillance technologies originally created for, counterinsurgency, counterterrorism efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan, then being deployed in the local context, like you're saying. And a lot of the time that's not as visible as like a tank rolling down the street or, responding with military gear to protests or something like that. But I think it's still a very important part of the story because it imports that like military logic, that
Hmm.
counterinsurgent logic into local policing.
What were some of the examples off the top of your head that you saw of that logic and how kind of casually it's deployed?
Yeah, well, I mean, so I think like a classic example is the use of this platform designed by Palantir Technologies. So
Oh boy.
Palantir, yeah,
Yeah.
okay, so you guys probably talk about that. So anyway, for those who don't know, Palantir is this like data integration platform, has all kinds of government and commercial customers. Okay, initially funded by InQtel, which is the CIA's venture capital fund. Anyway, they create this data integration platform where you can combine all of these previously disparate sources of data. It was originally created for counterterror efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan, like I was saying. And now that is sort of the platform that the LAPD uses to integrate disparate sources of data. So everything from 911 calls to automatic vehicle or automatic license plate reader readings. That's an example of a dragnet surveillance tool. You don't have to have done anything wrong, committed any crime in order to have your car picked up by these automatic license plate readers that are all over the city. And so in this platform, then you have understandings of the distribution of people in a city, and you can build out these like social networks, for example, and create risk scores of people that are more or less likely to commit crime in the future. And so I think it's really like the importation and deployment of these tools. This is like one of the vectors through which we're finding this playing out in the local law enforcement context.
Right. I mean, and it also is, it's the I guess it was Foucault who wrote about the surveillance tower within prisons
Yeah,
and
the
how
panopticon.
the
The
pen there we
panopticon.
go.
Yeah.
I haven't thought about that since college in a
I know.
way.
I was like, college. Let's, yeah, get back
Yeah,
to the.
let's tap back into that moment. But like that, but that's what that is, right? It's the nature of pre-crime, and how you constantly feel like you're under surveillance when because the reality is that I mean, people aren't aware of this in the way they should be, and that's why your book is so important. But that's the philosophy of policing behind this kind of stuff.
I think so. I think it's so. I mean, like surveillance scholars love to get in arguments about Foucault or whatever, which I will not get into here to like totally bore your listeners and your
We're
viewers.
very dry over
But
here. Don't worry.
but yeah, basically, I think that okay. So the way the panopticon thing works is that then the logic is that people start to police themselves, right? Because they don't know if the guy in the central tower is looking at them and policing them or not. So it's like this very efficient use of power. I think there's some of that going on with this, the electronic panopticon, if you will. But also, I think part of its power of like electronic surveillance is this invisibility that it can seep into our lives. We don't
No,
know
you're
what
right.
digital traces are
Yeah.
like. But no, I do think it is definitely a useful metaphor. This idea of omnipresent surveillance, like all these digital traces we leave in the course of our everyday lives, perhaps no one of them we would take issue with the police having access to, right? It's like, oh, you write something in the public domain on the internet, or you make some purchase or whatever, fine. But what legal scholars and lawyers are really up in arms about is this idea that the aggregation of all of these little digital traces that we leave grants the government a level of insight into our lives that totally previously would have constituted a search, and therefore like had these legal requirements or thresholds that must be met. But now that's just like not the case in the digital world.
Yeah, I mean one of the constitutional erosions that does not get discussed enough is just the complete erosion of the Fourth Amendment. And
Yeah.
every time over the 20th century, the case law on that front, and then this is really
Yeah.
beyond the scope of your book, but like the case law on that front is it pretty much universal every time in giving police more discretion for a drug dog to come up to the a crack in your front door and
Mm.
smell, and that doesn't constitute a search for reasonable suspicion in the way that people are driving around in their cars. All of this has been throughout the ideology changes on the Supreme Court, been a fairly universal kind of push towards giving police a lot of this, and then there's the stuff that we don't know about that you write,